So the northern Protestant regions of the Netherlands began rebelling against their Spanish rulers in about 1568. By 1579, they had joined together as the United Provinces, but it wasn't actually until about 80 years later, in about 1648, that they finally gained their independence as the Dutch Republic. Now, foreign trade was at the center of the Dutch economy, and their mercantile skills, along with their strengths in shipbuilding and cartography, really allowed them to dominate Western European trade with the Baltic region, China, and Japan in the 17th century. Now, as a result, Dutch citizens had the highest income per capita in Europe, and they displayed that wealth through the decoration of their lavish homes and the patronage of fine art objects. Art historians estimate more than 1 million paintings were produced in the Dutch Republic during the 17th century, and even relatively poor households typically owned at least a few paintings or prints. Art was so popular amongst merchants and working class people that artists often had to compete to capture the interest of the public, and so they began producing paintings to offer for sale rather than waiting around for commissions. Specialists in popular types of images were the most likely to be financially successful, and what Dutch patrons wanted most were paintings of themselves or portraits, paintings of their landscapes, their countryside, their cities, paintings of their possessions and their homes, so still lives and interior scenes, and images of the life around them, so genre scenes of everyday life, which was really characterized by active trade and bustling commercialism, as well as the Protestant faith. Now, many Dutch citizens were also well educated, and so they were interested in things like history, mythology, scientific advancement, colonial exploration, as well as the Bible and religious histories. The influence of Caravaggio's dramatic Baroque style was felt in the Protestant regions of the Netherlands just as it was in the southern Catholic lands. Hendrik ter Brugghen was an artist from Utrecht, and he studied in Rome between about 1608 and 1614, where he became an enthusiastic follower of Caravaggio. After he returned home, he joined the Utrecht Painters Guild, and he introduced the style to the Netherlands with works like this one, Saint Sebastian Tended by Saint Irene. So this is very Baroque in that St. Sebastian's body sort of breaks out of this stable triangular format that was so standard in the High Renaissance by slumping forward and creating this sort of strong diagonal composition here with kind of his torso and his upper body. We also have a strong diagonal in his arm that stretches across as he's still bound at the wrist, and then we could maybe read diagonals in his upper and lower legs as well. So our composition is kind of made up of these, crossing diagonal lines, which helps to enhance the sense of tension. We also have that really Baroque sense of immediacy here, as well as a sort of emotional engagement with these figures that are kind of crowded into the front of the picture plane, and then this dramatic tenebrism and the frank realism of the figures, both of which are sort of classic Caravaggio. So ter Brugghen is Dutch, but he's really adopted this Italian Baroque style, a la Caravaggio, and then younger generations of Netherlandish painters, including Peter Paul Rubens in Antwerp, and other Dutch artists like Hals, Rembrandt, and Vermeer, all of these will sort of look up to ter Brugghen and so to Caravaggio through him. Frans Hals was the leading painter in the Dutch city of Haarlem, and he was also inspired by Caravaggio via artists like ter Brugghen, as well as the Spanish artist Velázquez. Hals really sought to sort of capture the optical effects of light on colors, forms, and textures, and his technique involved painting with bold, slashing strokes that create angular patches of color that aren't fully blended, so at a distance the colors seem to sort of merge and create the illusion of flickering light over solid forms. Hals' works tend to have this sense of effortlessness and spontaneity that kind of enliven the scenes. Now, Hals specialized in portraiture, which typically served as a statement of the sitter's identity and status, but Hals really managed to infuse a sense of mood, emotion, and even personality into these as well. Now, group portraits were especially important in the Dutch Republic, and they were often used to document the membership of corporate organizations, and Hals was one of the artists who was sort of best at these. Group portraits really challenge artists to create not only an accurate individual likeness of their subjects, but also an interesting and coherent visual composition and narrative. Hals really transforms the Dutch tradition of group portraiture from stiff lines of static frontal figures into these depictions of sort of casual, lively social interactions that emphasize the personality of each subject, not just their physical likeness. So these group portraits, again, they were often used to document membership of various commercial and community organizations. And so this one by Hals from about 1627 shows the officers of the Haarlem Militia Company of St. Adrian. So this was a group of military guards, essentially, who protected the city of Haarlem. Officials of the group would have been upper middle class, while ordinary guards would have been tradespeople and craftspeople. Notice how Hals has sort of designed this composition using these strong diagonal lines that repeat across the canvas. We can see them in the banners, in the sashes that the men wear, and even in some of the gestures that the men make. And then we have the perpendiculars of the table, of the window, and kind of maybe the glass that's being held here as well, that sort of contrast with those diagonals and help balance them out and create stability. And you can also sort of get a sense of how Hals has applied these loose brush strokes and bold swaths of color and a variety of light and shadow to really mimic those optical effects of light bouncing off different surfaces and different textures. Now he's included accurate portrait likenesses of all of the figures here, but he's also made them sort of come alive by having them interact with one another, having some of them sort of look out and make direct contact with the viewer and kind of engaging our space and really creating this sort of again, sort of lively, dynamic group portrait that not only captures the likenesses of these individuals, but more of their personality as well. Another prominent Dutch painter is Judith Leyster. She was actually a contemporary and close friend of Frans Hals. She was accepted into Haarlem's Guild for St. Luke, which was the Painters Guild, in about 1633, which is a very rare achievement for a female artist during this time. Leyster specialized in informal scenes of everyday life, so genre scenes, and often she incorporated sort of underlying moralistic themes. She was especially known for things like this work, which feature what are called merry company figures, which are essentially kind of casual genre scenes of musicians and singers. So in this self-portrait of Judith Leyster from around 1630 to 35, the artist is shown leaning back from her painting to sort of look at the viewer. She's sort of stopped and twisted as if we've just maybe stepped into the room and kind of interrupted her process here. She's apparently been working on one of these merry company figures, so kind of showing off the type of painting she would have been best known for. Her expression is sort of relaxed and confident, maybe even sort of bemused. And she wears this rather expensive dress, and then she's seated upon this rather ornately carved chair. And so these objects really provide an opportunity for the artist to kind of showcase her technical skill and her remarkable understanding of light and surface textures, but they really also serve as symbols for her success as an artist as well. Notice how she sort of used this tight, kind of delicate brushwork on the hand, on her face, and even kind of in this white fluffy collar around her neck. But then along the sleeve here, and especially down here on her skirt, she's using this sort of bold, wide, loose brush stroke that creates these, patches of color and value. Now, this is quite different from the very dramatic religious emotionality of the Italian Baroque. Instead, Dutch artists sort of appealed to the merchant class with a quieter Baroque style that depicted common, everyday scenes infused with a certain sense of spontaneity. Leicester again has depicted herself in this somewhat awkward position as she's sort of caught in mid-turn, just as she's paused her work again to kind of interact with us. Her direct eye contact, her natural expression, and kind of her partially open mouth suggests that she's maybe on the verge of either greeting us or maybe chiding us for interrupting her. We've got that Baroque sense of closeness and intimacy with this rather shallow space here. And notice how her forearm and hand, and then this paintbrush, and then these paintbrushes in her arm here as well, these have been sort of foreshortened to suggest they're sort of reaching out into and engaging the viewer's space. Leicester also really shows sort of a sense of confidence here, both in her technical skill as a painter and in her own identity. She's demonstrating this sense of self-awareness too. She sort of painted a painting of a painter painting a painting. And so additionally, x-rays of this work show that the Mary figure on the canvas here on the easel was actually a portrait, originally a portrait of a seated female figure, and that may have even been a self-portrait. And so in that case, this would have become a painting of, a self-portrait of a painter painting a painting of a self-portrait. It's become very sort of meta in that way. But I think it's likely that Leicester is also thinking about her experiences as a female artist and about how women are often seen as objects to be viewed by men, but they don't have any, control over their own lives or things like that. John Berger, in a later chapter of his book Ways of Seeing, says, quote, "One might simplify this by saying, men act and women appear. Men look at women and women watch themselves being looked at," end quote. So maybe this is Judith Leicester's way of sort of taking back some of that autonomy, and she's sort of telling her viewer, I can be the one who does the looking just the same. So really the most prolific painter in 17th century Amsterdam was Rembrandt van Rijn. Now Rembrandt was certainly influenced by Caravaggio. He was interested in naturalism, drama, tenebrism. He was a very well-known portrait painter of both individuals and groups, but he also painted genre, narrative, and landscape scenes. Throughout his career, he painted several self-portraits, and so these two are from 1658 and 1659, respectively, so they're both from later in his career and in his life. I think these are nice because they really show us his mastery of oil paint and kind of its luminous qualities. He's given us kind of an example in both of these as well of his sort of loose painterly style and his sensitivity to the human condition. In each of these, he's in sort of a casual and relaxed yet regal pose. And notice the frank realism in the face. We can really see his age and kind of his wrinkled, sagging skin. His eyes look directly at the viewer and kind of pull us in. And there's this sense of life there and sort of a sense of knowledge, yet also maybe a weariness. These are sort of quiet, almost contemplative portraits, yet there's also kind of an intensity here, created at least in part by this dramatic tenebrism, which highlights the sort of loose, bold brushstrokes, at least here on the left side, that cover kind of his chest with the fabric here, and then kind of the bold strokes of the sleeve. And then we have these sort of strong, somewhat angular strokes along his fingers here that serve to convey maybe a sense of tension. Again, both these portraits from 1658 and 1659, later in his career, and actually after 1656, which was a rather difficult year for Rembrandt. He had to declare bankruptcy and sell his house and his entire art collection. So perhaps he's kind of reflecting that stress here. And maybe he's trying to emphasize sort of his resiliency as someone who's been through a lot, but who has survived with their dignity intact. So here we have Rembrandt's first group portrait, which he did around the age of 25, and so this really launched his career forward. This was a group portrait for the Guild of Surgeons in Amsterdam. Dr. Tulp was the head surgeon from 1628 to 1652. And so once a year, this guild would host a public dissection of a body for instruction. And so Rembrandt here is really demonstrating a combination of scientific and humanistic interests because he's presented us with this compelling narrative that's sort of populated with recognizable portraits. Now, Renaissance artists had, of course, studied anatomy by dissecting cadavers, but mostly that was done kind of quietly or in secret. But this subject and this sort of composition really shows us a much more public interest in science in the 17th century. So we have Dr. Tulp standing kind of just to the right here. He is instructing this group of younger surgeons who has gathered around this diagonal slab that sort of juts across the scene and really serves to connect the learners to kind of the upper left with this open anatomy book that's in the foreground. Again, creating this sort of active narrative scene that includes accurate, identifiable portraits. Notice that Tulp sort of lifts up on the cadaver's arm muscles with these forceps, and then he holds up his own hand on the other side to kind of demonstrate the muscles in action. Rembrandt has also sort of applied this dramatic lighting, this tenebrism in the style of Caravaggio. So these very naturalistic figures sort of emerge from this dark, shadowy background, and their attentive faces are all sort of framed by these kind of bright, white, rough collars. 10 years later, in 1642, Rembrandt was one of several well-known artists who were commissioned to make large group portraits for a wealthy city guard company called the Cloveniers. Now, groups like these had played a very important role in cities like Amsterdam during the wars against Spain and the turmoil of the Protestant and Catholic Reformations. By Rembrandt's time, their function was largely ceremonial, but it was still sort of a prestigious position, and these men still garnered a lot of respect. So this work, titled The Company of Captain Frans Bonning Koch, this is another sort of dramatic narrative event that includes more than 18 individual portraits situated within sort of the context of a larger dynamic scene that's highlighted by these sort of intense tenebristic lighting. The composition has really been built using this series of diagonals and broad V shapes that sort of stretch upwards and outwards and kind of make the picture seem like it's bursting from the center here. This certainly has that Baroque sense of disorder and asymmetry rather than the highly ordered, stable geometric compositions of the High Renaissance. There's also a greater sense of naturalism here, again, that sort of frank realism a la Caravaggio instead of the Renaissance idealism. Now, Rembrandt has shown this group assembling in the street, maybe in preparation for a parade, and he's also kind of created this naturally deep space of the street to situate all of these figures within. So here in the central foreground we have Captain Koch in black with this rich red sash across his chest. Notice how his arm has been foreshortened as he's sort of gesturing forwards, and he turns his head slightly to speak to his lieutenant here in yellow. And then the street behind them is really just buzzing with activity and movement, and we have all of these figures in a variety of poses and with different gestures and expressions and actions. Now, the name of the company, the Cloveniers, this was based on the name of a type of gun that they used called clowers. And so there's this interesting emphasis on the gun within this composition. We have this man here shown kind of preparing to use his rifle. He's sort of loading it. And then just behind the captain, we have this man with his sort of feet set apart who actually raises his gun and fires. Again, it's kind of behind the captain there, so it's a little hard to see. But here's the barrel of his gun, and you can sort of see this plume of smoke coming from it and kind of blending with the feather on the hat that the lieutenant wears here. And then just kind of behind and to the side of the lieutenant, we have this third man who is shown cleaning his gun. So we sort of see, this gun or this musket in 3 different stages of use here. Now, Rembrandt has also included a few figures who were not members of this militia group, including himself, right here in the center between the captain and the lieutenant, wearing this brown beret and kind of looking pretty directly out at the viewer. But we also have this interesting little girl who has been rather strongly kind of illuminated by this kind of spotlight as she strides confidently through the crowd and kind of glances, I don't know, maybe towards the captain, or maybe she's looking past him and kind of looking again at us, at the viewer. Now, notice on her belt here, she has this dead chicken that's kind of tied and she's carrying it along. So in Dutch, the word for chicken is klauw. And so this is probably meant to be a pun on the name of the gun, Klauwer, and therefore the company's name, the Cloveniers. And this company actually adopted a sigil featuring a golden chicken claw on a blue background, which you can sort of make out here on the banner that's being kind of held aloft above all of these figures in the scene. Now, up until the 1970s, this painting was believed to be a night scene, and so for a long time, it's been sort of nicknamed the Night Watch, but a cleaning and restoration in 1975 and 76 removed layers upon layers of grime and smoke and just soot, and that revealed much sort of brighter, richer, more vivid colors, including what is actually a bright sort of lemon yellow on the lieutenant's costume, and then a sort of golden light that is cast across the entire scene. Now, Rembrandt operated a very busy, successful painting studio, but he was also an avid printmaker. He felt the medium had its own valuable aesthetic qualities, and he sort of championed it as its own art form rather than just a way to make copies of paintings. He was one of the first artists to really popularize this intaglio printmaking technique called etching, which is really great for producing fine, detailed lines. Etching is somewhat like engraving, but it goes a bit further. So in the etching technique, the metal print plate is first covered with this sort of acid-resistant resin. And then, instead of carving lines into the hard print plate, the artist simply scratches their image into the softer resin with a sharp needle to expose the metal underneath. Then the plate is put into a bath of acid that eats away at the exposed metal, and by controlling the amount of time that the metal is exposed, the artist can make either fine, sort of shallow lines or deeper, heavier ones. After the resin is removed, artists can make an impression to sort of check their lines, and then if changes need to be made, they can sort of erase them by buffing them out with a metal scraper. They can, adjust different elements of the composition, or maybe add darker lines to create kind of a variety of values. They can put it back into the acid bath for a little while. And so you can kind of get a sense of how, if you were trying to make a rather complex composition with a variety of tonal values, this would be rather a long process. But once the artist was satisfied, the process is then kind of like that of engraving. The plate would be covered in ink, then it would be wiped off, leaving only the ink in the etched lines, and then paper is placed over the plate, and both are put under a heavy press to transfer the ink and therefore the image. And so we can sort of compare Rembrandt's 1638 etching of Adam and Eve with Albert Durer's engraving of the same subject from 1504 to really see the differences between these two printmaking techniques, and a difference in style as well. So notice how Rembrandt's etching really uses these fine, wiry lines to sort of depict the, much less idealized, fleshy bodies of Adam and Eve, and their sort of ordinary faces with a sense of naturalism or maybe even that frank realism that really makes it much easier for the viewer to identify with them than Durer's sort of classically idealized figures here. So instead of perfect proportions and kind of, idealism like Durer has emphasized, Rembrandt instead emphasizes, humanism and realism. His Adam and Eve really seem to be sort of confused and anxious about their temptation. And you can kind of see, again, how Rembrandt was able to create these much more sort of fluid, detailed lines than Durer was, because it's far easier to work on the waxy resin surface than it is to sort of carve into the hard metal. So overall, etching becomes much closer to sort of the freedom that an artist has when they're drawing with, say, pencil on paper. So etching is great for fluid, detailed lines, but to really add a rich variety of tones to his print, Rembrandt would often incorporate yet another intaglio technique called dry point. So like engraving, dry point uses a sharp tool to scratch lines directly into the surface of the print plate, but in this case, the burr, or the sort of metal that's been pushed up by this dry point tool, it's not scraped and polished away like it would be on an engraving. And so in dry point, both the burr and the groove kind of hold on to the ink. And so this creates a richer, more velvety black that's just not achievable with engraving or etching. Now, additionally, Rembrandt tended to use a sort of softer metal for his printing plates, and that allowed him to draw more freely, and so his prints have the sort of rapid spontaneity or fluidity of a sketch. Unfortunately, though, because this dry point burr is very delicate, it wears down quickly, so usually you get no more than about a dozen or so prints with each plate before the burr has flattened down and kind of lost its definition and its character. So in about 1653, Rembrandt did a series of prints depicting the three crosses, and these serve as an excellent example of his use of dry point. So again, like etching, dry point allows for reworking, so you can go back in and add more lines for greater tonal variation, or you can maybe buff out shallow lines and kind of rework the composition. And so in this case, Rembrandt did this process 5 different times for this series, and so we say that this series has 5 states or 5 stages of his sort of creative process. And so here we're looking at the first state and then the fourth state. And so in this composition, you can really see that Rembrandt has sought to sort of capture the moment from the crucifixion narrative that is described in the Gospels when Jesus says, quote, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit," and then darkness comes over the earth. And so we're sort of positioned on the hill of Golgotha. We have a central Christ on the cross, and then the 2 other crosses with thieves. And so the landscape kind of dominates the foreground. And at least here in the first state, we have this sort of heavenly light that illuminates the center where Christ is on the cross. Just to the side, kind of in the crowd here, we have the Virgin Mary, who's being supported by John, but then we also have these other figures who are starting to run away from the scene, and then directly next to Mary, we have this centurion who's kneeling in front of Jesus on the cross. Now, by the fourth state, the composition has become considerably darker, and some of the figures, including Mary and John's little grouping here, some of these have been completely removed. Now notice how in the first state we have this soldier kind of next to the cross here, facing towards the left on his horse, holding his spear up into the air. In the fourth state, now the horse has been turned around so that the soldier is facing towards Christ on the cross, and he sort of holds his spear out towards him. Now, in the first state, it seems that Rembrandt, he's kind of creatively made this very descriptive, readable narrative, but here in the fourth state, he's really increasing the emotional resonance by simplifying and compressing the elements and sort of obscuring the narrative with these dramatic shadows that seem to reduce the scene down to its most mysterious essence. Dutch patrons also delighted in pure landscape scenes. They were very proud of their country with its sort of rolling hills and vast skies, so landscapes are often somewhat nationalistic or patriotic. Dutch landscape artists did not work on site, but rather in their studios, and so they would arrange, add, or subtract elements within the composition to create a more sort of formally organized or visually interesting scene, or maybe to convey a specific mood. A common motif in Dutch landscape scenes is the emphasis on sort of a vast expanse of cloud-filled sky that dominates a rather narrow strip of earth below. So this artist, Jacob van Ruisdael, he was a pretty widely popular landscape specialist from the city of Haarlem, and he was really known for his dramatic compositions and for his ability to convey mood. So this work is one of his best known. It's from about 1670, and it's titled A View of Haarlem from the Dunes at Overveen. So we have this vast kind of panoramic view of the city of Haarlem kind of here in the distance, including this huge Gothic church of St. Bavos. And then we also have kind of the surrounding countryside of the city here in sort of the foreground. Now this work is sort of a celebration of part of the lands that the Dutch had recently sort of reclaimed from the sea through this massive landfill project. And so in the composition we have this, 3/4 of the canvas really that's been given over to the sky, kind of filled with these soft, puffy clouds. And then across the ground below, we have tiny little human figures who are shown kind of working, and they're actually spreading out these long sheets of white linen, kind of stretching them across the fields here so that they can bleach in the sun. Linen was one of Haarlem's most principal industries, and so this painting may have even been commissioned by a linen company. But we seem to have this sort of glorification of not only the Dutch landscape, but the sort of hardworking nature of the Dutch citizens who populate it, and kind of the celebration of the products that the citizens are able to pull from their land to kind of take care of themselves. And so, again, we have that sort of patriotic undertone here. So cityscapes were also popular among Dutch patrons, and so this one is quite similar in composition to Ruisdael's view of Haarlem, in that we have kind of a good portion of the canvas being given over to the, vast sky and its puffy clouds, but now we have a much more sort of urban scene. This is a view of the city of Delft. And so this work is painted by a Dutch artist, Johannes Vermeer. Vermeer joined the Delft Artists Guild in about 1653, and he only painted for local patrons. He was incredibly meticulous in technique, and he favored highly structured compositions, yet a sort of soft, fluid painting style. Now again, Vermeer, as many of these other Dutch artists in the 17th century, he sort of falls on the quieter side of the Baroque. Rather than that, overly dramatic and religious Italian Baroque style. Vermeer tended to work very slowly, producing only about 3 paintings each year, and so today there are fewer than 40 canvases that we can sort of definitively attribute to him. Vermeer here has created this sort of authentic looking scene, but he has not actually created a photographic reproduction of the city. Instead, he's really moved certain buildings around to create a more ideal composition. And he's really sort of emphasized horizontals, and then, with this careful placement of the buildings, that creates this sense of stability. And then we have this very clear, sort of even lighting that comes out from below these low-lying clouds that illuminates the sort of quiet atmosphere of the city. Notice these beautiful reflections and kind of shadows across the surface of the water. And then, of course, we have that very classic kind of northern attention to, minute detail in the architecture of the city, but also kind of in the figures here in the foreground. Now, it's likely that Vermeer may have used a tool called a camera obscura to help capture the precise details of his scene. Now, this would have not been to help him recreate the scene exactly as it was in reality, but rather it was to help him kind of study the fine details and further analyze them. So the camera obscura, this is a tool that has been in use since probably about 500 CE. And so originally it consisted of kind of this portable room or tent that had a small hole in one side. And so this functions in the same way that the human eye functions. When light is shined through this hole, it projects an inverted image of the exterior scene on this interior wall. Then the artist could come in and kind of trace out parts of that scene, again, to help kind of, study and get the fine details of the scene more accurate. By the second half of the 16th century, artists really understood that they didn't have to be inside of this box for this process to work, and so they sort of condensed the camera obscura, and often they would add a mirror into it, and so the light would come in through the small hole, and then it would hit the mirror and kind of re-invert, so the camera obscura would project the image right side up, and then again the artist could sort of trace the projections as studies that they could use to inform their larger composition. So the majority of Vermeer's canvases are genre scenes that depict interior spaces, often with women either alone or with their servants, kind of shown busy with their domestic life, or maybe occupied by some sort of calm, refined women's activity like writing, reading, playing music, etc. He also really loves to arrange his compositions somewhat asymmetrically, yet with a good deal of geometric precision, and he really likes to frame his figures in a space with sort of side lighting like this. Now, he tends to use sort of gentle color palettes, and so his scenes are rather subdued and quiet, even contemplative or maybe somber. So this work here is titled Woman Holding a Balance, and this is very sort of asymmetrical, and yet it's balanced out. We have this even pearly light that kind of streams in from the window to the side and gives the subjects, solidity, and it kind of casts the figure in this diagonal shadow that kind of stretches across the scene here. Vermeer is, again, very meticulous, and so everything within his scene is meant to add, a level of balance and clarity to the overall composition. So we have this wealthy upper-class woman. She's wearing this sort of linen cap, which would have been typical for a woman to wear if she was just going to be at home. And then she's holding this small set of scales or a balance. Now, on the table in front of her, we have this open jewelry box and jewelry kind of, being pulled out of it. We have jewelry, jewels, coins, all these things kind of laid out on the table. And then we have this smaller box, which is presumably for the balance. The balance kind of implies the act of weighing or measuring, and then the woman's expression kind of furthers, maybe underscores, I guess, this idea of quiet contemplation or maybe judgment. But notice the scales are empty, though, and it's sort of difficult to tell if maybe she's, just about to weigh all of these goods and kind of determine her wealth, or maybe she's just finished this act. Now notice behind her on the wall we have this painting of a Last Judgment scene. We've got Christ kind of in this glowing full body halo that floats directly above the woman's head, and then she sort of divides the blessed from the damned across the bottom of that painting there. So the placement kind of creates this interesting juxtaposition between worldly possessions and achievement and the idea of faith and piety. Maybe Vermeer here, who was a Catholic artist kind of working in Protestant lands, maybe he's trying to slip in this reference to the eternal judgment to sort of imply that this woman is contemplating maybe her faith or the fate of her soul, and so she's measuring non-tangible things like character and her good deeds. Or, maybe this is intended as a critical statement on her sort of worldliness, her materiality, and maybe even her vanity, which could be underscored by the mirror that's on the wall directly across from her. And so perhaps this is sort of the cautionary statement to the viewer saying, don't become too focused on worldly possessions and achievements, but instead focus on their faith in God. Still life scenes were also very popular among Dutch patrons. So this genre depicted both everyday and luxury possessions, and it really offered artists an opportunity to show off their technical virtuosity at sort of rendering different forms, textures, colors, and light effects. And then these are also kind of used to document the wealth and achievement of the patron or the owner, but artists would also often infuse their still lifes with sort of moralizing or symbolic messages. So Peter Claes, he was one of the first Dutch still life painters, and so this work, Still Life with Taza, is a common type of northern still life called a breakfast piece. That is sort of a scene with a meal of fruit, bread, and nuts. And so Claes has created sort of this strong sense of space with the kind of diagonal placement of the plates here. And then he's really reinforced it by foreshortening this plate in the foreground and kind of foreshortening the balanced knife a little bit. And then we have this lemon peel that sort of spirals off the plate and into the viewer's space. Kind of activating or maybe engaging us in this composition. He's kind of using this subtle, somewhat monochromatic color palette that really creates this quiet, contemplative mood, but he's really rendered the maximum contrast of textures here. We've got this overturned silver dish, or taza, and that kind of contrasts with the half-filled glass just next to it. And then both of these materials, the glass and the silver, both of these really allow Claes to kind of play with transparency and reflection, and again, really show off his skills. So one common theme of Dutch still lifes is the vanitas theme. So the term vanitas is Latin, meaning literally vanity, but sort of in the sense of futility or maybe the worthlessness of actions, things, etc. So as a subgenre of painting, vanitas are still life paintings that depict objects that symbolize the transience of life and material possessions, the futility of worldly pleasures and achievements, and the inevitability of death. So here, this knife potentially might symbolize human vulnerability and mortality. The meticulously painted timepiece kind of here to the side, and along, with the fact that we have kind of this scene that makes it seem like this little quiet breakfast has just been interrupted. We have these items that have been sort of haphazardly left out. Both of these things kind of tell us that Claes is thinking about the passage of time and how the moment, in this case of breakfast, has sort of just abruptly passed, and thinking about how life will sort of always move on. Here's another example by Claes, and so again we have kind of this meticulously rendered arrangement of objects, but this one makes for an even better example of this vanitas theme. So to the right, kind of in the background, we have a skull, which makes for an obvious memento mori, or sort of this, reminder that death is inevitable. The books here symbolize human curiosity and knowledge and kind of the limitations and temporary nature of these things. We have a timepiece, again, kind of meticulously rendered in very minute detail that clearly references the passage of time and maybe the fleeting nature of life. And then we have kind of this tipped up glass and this cracked walnut in the right corner that again imply that maybe a person was perhaps just here enjoying wine and food, but they sort of abruptly had to, jump up and leave. So maybe these symbolize the fleeting pleasures of life. But the fragility of glass kind of as a material and the brokenness of this walnut probably are also meant to reference the fragility of human life. The violin reminds us of music, which is also transient. It only lasts for a certain amount of time and it will always end, again, just like human life. And then behind the violin here we have what looks to be maybe an oil lamp, although it doesn't seem to be lit or burning. So this is probably a symbol of death or maybe a soul that has sort of been snuffed out. Now, interestingly here, Claes includes this mirror ball on the left side of the composition, which again really allows him to show off his technical kind of virtuosity and play with the reflected light from, the window in the room and also with the sort of distorted reflections of the objects on the table there. But also notice he has included a little self-portrait of himself working on this painting at his easel. And so this kind of adds a new layer of maybe self-awareness to the message, as if the artist is reminding himself of the transience of his own life and accomplishments. But by recording his reflection, he's also kind of directly challenging this idea and ensuring that his name and his image and his accomplishments will sort of live on after his death through his paintings or through his work. So another important type of Dutch still life paintings were flower pieces, which are simply just arrangements of cut flowers. Now, flowers were very important to the Dutch Republic, and then, just as now, they were sort of major growers, exporters, and importers of flowers for both herbal and medicinal uses, but also as sort of beautiful and good-smelling luxury items. Artists would use precise color sketches and illustrations from newly published scientifically accurate botany books to create these careful arrangements of various flowers, many of which would never bloom at the same time. The short life of cut flowers also adds sort of a poignant Vanitas theme that reminds the viewer of the fleeting nature of beauty and of human life. One of the most successful Dutch flower painters was Rachel Roush from Amsterdam. During her 70-year career, she produced more than 250 paintings, and these often sold for twice as much as what Rembrandt's were selling for, and this made Roush one of the most highest paid and popular still life painters in Europe. So Roush's father, he was a scientist. He studied anatomy and botany, and he was also an architect, and so he arranged for a painting apprenticeship for her, and then he really inspired her with this kind of impressive sense of scientific accuracy in her depictions of different types of flowers. Roush often emphasizes the beauty of kind of the curving flower stems, and she incorporates diagonal, sort of asymmetrical compositions and this rather tenebristic lighting that really illuminates the rich colors of her various flowers, including poppies, snapdragons, roses, carnations, hollyhocks, marigolds, morning glories, and various types of tulips. She also sometimes added things like pieces of fruit, insects, snails, and so often, kind of like here on the right, often the fruit is decaying and the insects are sort of eating at it, as well as these wilting flowers, all of which sort of furthers the Vanitas theme of the transience of beauty and of life. Now, tulips were especially loved by the Dutch because they were considered exotic. They had only been introduced to the Netherlands from Turkey in the 16th century, and throughout the 17th century, the supply simply could not meet the demand. Tulip prices rose steadily in until about 1636, when this very rare type of tulip called the Semper Augustus was sold for 5,200 guilders, which at the time would have been more than the price of a very fine house, a ship, or 12 acres of land. So in February of 1637, investors decided that the flowers had become far too overpriced, and they began to drop their prices to try to sell their stocks. Within the next few days, panic really ensued, and the market was flooded with more sellers than buyers. Prices plummeted, tulip bulbs lost about 90% of their earlier value, and the whole market crashed, resulting in the world's first financial bubble. The Semper Augustus tulip has these kind of white petals with these dark blood red streaks, and so she's included one kind of right here at the top of this composition, and so that really serves as kind of a clear, Vanitas message, kind of this warning to Dutch consumers to not become so attached to their material possessions.